Hey, welcome. I'm Johnny, and today I'm going to show you how to use Reddit's API to find the top posters in your favorite subreddit. And I have an example here. This is what our final product will look like. It's a simple page in which we can input the name of our favorite subreddit. So I'm going to use learn JavaScript. And when we press rank or press enter, after a couple seconds, what we'll get is a ranked list of the top posters in that subreddit. And we're going to make this together in the next few minutes using JavaScript. Particularly, we'll be using some techniques from ES6 and ES7. So let's get started. Our project folder is going to use only 3 files: index.html, script.js, and style.css. So right now, I have these three files in a folder, and they're blank. The first one we want to fill in is index.html. In index.html, we just need a simple HTML skeleton. And put the title, I'm going to call it Reddit Ranking. And make sure that you're importing the right files in the link tag and the script tag. So in link, I'm going to import style.css. And for the script tag, I'm importing script.js. Oh, missed that. And inside the body, I need a few things. First, put an h1 with the same title, Reddit Rankings. Then put a form. Your form is not going to have an action. Your form is going to have an ID of subreddit select form. And within this form, we need an input with an ID of subreddit. And we also need a button of type submit and an ID. Oh, actually, this one doesn't need an ID. And this one will just we'll put rank as a text. And if it helps, you can also put a label for that input, so it'll look nice. And the label just needs to be r/. The last thing you need in your HTML is a container where we can put in all the results after the search is made. So let's just make a div tag. And let's give this div an ID of results container. And we should be good. That's all we need for this file. All the other changes to the HTML will be done automatically with our script. Next, we want to change style.css. Now, this is the one part of this project where I'm just going to copy and paste it and not explain it too much, because I really want to spend most of this video explaining the JavaScript. So I already had the styles made before. Feel free to pause the video and write them out. But basically all it's doing, it's nothing too complicated. I'm just putting some styles on the container to make sure that each list item lines up properly. And I'm putting some styles on each user card to make sure that it has a border and some space between each one. The only curveball in there might be the flex, if you're not familiar with flex blocks, but I'll put a link in the description where you can read how it works. So I'm just going to leave that be. Once, like I said, just pause it and copy it if you want. And now I'm going to get into the main part of what this app is all about, which is the script. So for starters, just to make sure it's all working okay, you can just put console log hello from script and open up index.html in Chrome to make sure it works. Please make sure you're using the latest version of Google Chrome, because we'll be using a lot of the newer techniques from ES6 and ES7 that some older browsers might not be compatible with. And the only way you can make that work is by transpiling the code, which is kind of out of the scope of this video. So just to keep things simple, just make sure you're using the latest version of Chrome and you should be okay. Open up Chrome and go to your index.html. And you should see something like this, Reddit rankings. And if you open up the console, you should see hello from script right here in the console. Before we start working on building out our script, it's important to understand how Reddit's API works. And it's going to be really simple in our case. In order to access the resource from Reddit's API and get back a JSON object, we can use the same link that we would use to access the web page with a slight difference. Let's take a look at an example. If I wanted to see the posts from Learn JavaScript on Reddit, I would type in https://www.reddit.com/r/learn JavaScript. And that would take me to the posts from the Learn JavaScript subreddit. If I want to access the API and get back a JSON object, I use the same link, but I end it with .json. And now I get the same information in JSON format. Now this is unreadable right now, unless you have an extension that lets you clean it up. But you can easily see the object in a nice way by opening up your console, your DevTools, and going to the Network tab. In the Network tab, if you just refresh the page, you'll see the request that is made, and the very first one here, learn javascript.json, if you click it, you can see inside the preview tab the structure of the object that is coming back. So you can see it's an object that has two keys, data and kind. Inside data, you have after, before, children, dist, and mod hash. I'm going to explain the three that are relevant to us in this case. Children, after, and dist. Dist is the number of posts that are being sent back to us, and the default with the API is 25 posts. Children is the actual posts themselves, so it's actually an array with 25 objects inside of it, each representing information about a post. And after is kind of like a bookmark that we can use in the following request in order to fetch the next page of results. Because if you really think about it, if a subreddit has, say, 1,000 posts, and you fetch 25, that's not nearly all the posts there is, simple math. But you might want to get the rest of those, or you might want to get more. So with your first request, Reddit's API will send back along with the response, within the response, this string right here, which is the after property. And you can attach that to the next request in order to get the next page. So there are a couple of params that we can have. One, we can add the params with a question mark, and then let's put after equals, and we put the string that Reddit gave us back as the after property of the request that we just got back. And now on this, if we make the same request again, but this time with the after string inside the parameter, now Reddit is going to give us the following 25 posts as opposed to the same 25 that it gave us before. And along with these new 25 posts, it gives us a new after property that we can use to attach to the following request and make another fetch request to get the following 25. And you can just keep going and going and going. I'm not sure what the limit is, but for our app, we'll only be going to 500. Still, incrementing by 25 all the way to 500 is quite a bit. Luckily, Reddit allows you to receive up to 100 posts per request. And you can increase that by adding another parameter called limit. So here in my parameters, I have after equals the after string. I can also add ampersand and limit equals 100. And now when I press enter and make that request, I get back a list of 100 posts. And I can tell with the dist number that says 100, or if I wanted to, I could count out all the children and I would see that it's 100. So now that we understand how Reddit's API works for the sake of our app, we can actually start building out some JavaScript that can take advantage of this. So let's get started with that. In our script.js, we should lay out a few variables just to keep things understandable. The first one we'll define is posts per request. And Reddit allows this number to be up to 100, so let's just max it out and write 100. The next one we need is max post to fetch. And let's make this one 500. The reason why we're using 500 is because our requests are happening sequentially. So we're getting the first 100 and the next 100 and the next 100. And that can take time. And if we make this all the way up to 1,000, our app can take a long time to fetch the posts. And we want this to be nice and quick and easy to use. So for now, we're just going to stick to 500 just so that our code can run quickly enough. And the next variable that we need is max requests. So how many requests do we want to make? And you can easily figure that one out by taking the max post to fetch and dividing that by post per request. Post per request, sorry, singular. And in this case, that's going to give us 5. So really what we're saying here is we want 500 posts and we want to get 100 posts per each request. So we want to make 5 requests. You might have noticed that I'm using the keyword const to declare a variable as opposed to var. In ES6, it's common and even preferred to use the keywords const and let to declare variables. Use let when you're declaring a variable that might be reassigned later on in your code. And for variables that you know will not be reassigned within that scope, use the keyword const. We're not going to be changing any of those variables within this script, so we're using the keyword const. Once we have the variables, now we can start writing the scripts that are going to make up the bulk of this app. And we're only going to have 4 functions. The first one is handle submit. So let's define this one. Const handle submit. And I'm going to use an arrow function to declare it. This is another ES6 kind of technique, declaring variables using arrow function. It's pretty much the same as doing this. Var handle submit equals function. But it's just a bit of a cleaner way of doing it. And arrow functions have some functional differences as well, but those are irrelevant to this particular app. I'll put a link in the description where you can read more about arrow functions and how they work. But if you're going to be coding in ES6, you're going to be using arrow functions a lot more than any other kinds of function formatting. So we have handle submit. I'm lazy, so I'm just going to copy this 4 times down and rename it. The next function that we need is fetch posts. And then the one we need after that is parse results. And after parse results, we need display rankings. Okay, so handle submit. Handle submit is going to take the input take the string from our input when we submit the form. That's literally all it's going to do. So if we type in learn JavaScript or any other subreddit name, it's going to take that input, capture it as a string, and then pass it on to fetch posts so that we can fetch posts from the right subreddit. Fetch posts is going to make the fetch requests to Reddit's API, and once it gets back the results, it's going to call parse results. And then parse results is going to take all the responses from the requests made by fetch posts and use an algorithm to turn it all into a list of rankings that tells us which users have received the most points from their posts. Once it has that ranked list, it's going to call display rankings to put those rankings up on the DOM. on our document. There's one more variable that we need, and that's responses. So I'm going to declare const responses equals empty array. And this array is where we're going to store all the responses that come back when fetch post gets called, because fetch post is likely going to be called more than once. So we need a way to keep track of all the responses that are coming back every time fetch post is called. Before we fill out these functions, we need an event listener so that when our form is submitted, it'll trigger all these functions. So at the bottom here, let's first target our form by writing const subreddit select form equals document get element by ID, and we'll pass in the ID, which I believe is subreddit select form. Just to make sure, we'll just copy paste. Yeah, subreddit select form. And then on this subreddit select form, we'll add an event listener. And add event listener takes two arguments. One is the event that you want to listen to. In this case, it's submit. And the next is what you want to happen when this event is heard. In this case, we want to call a handle submit. And it's going to pass in the event object, and we want to prevent default because we're not actually submitting anything. So we'll put e.prevent default. And that should start the chain reaction of calling all these functions, because handle submit will call fetch posts, which will call parse results, which will call display rankings. Oh, it looks like I put an extra n there. So let me get rid of that. In display rankings, you can put console log display rankings, just so you can test it out here and make sure everything's okay. Save it. Now let's go back to our code. And when I refresh, I'm getting uncaught type error, cannot read add event listener of null. And this is because the script is running before the DOM is actually loaded. So it's trying to find a document, it's trying to find an element that doesn't actually exist yet. Well, we can solve this other than putting the script at the bottom, is just putting defer here. If we put the keyword defer inside the script tag, then our code will wait for the DOM to be loaded before it runs the script. So once that's there, we can go back, and when we refresh, we no longer get that error. We can type in whatever we want, so I'll just put pix now, and when I click, all the functions are called, and the very last one gives us a message that says display rankings. So all the functions so far are working great, but now let's make them do something. Let's start with handle submit. This one's going to be the easiest to modify. We only need to add a couple of things, and what we need to do is capture the value that was entered into the input. And for that to happen, we just need to declare a variable, const subreddit. And we need to assign to it document get element by ID, the value of the input that we can target using document get element by ID subreddit. Because as you might remember, this will refer to the input with the ID subreddit. So we can target it with document get element by ID, and we can use dot value to access this value. So what we're doing is finding the element that has an ID of subreddit, finding its value, and assigning that value to the variable subreddit. And now we can pass in subreddit into fetch posts so that we can fetch posts from the subreddit that we want. Now let's work on fetch posts. Fetch posts is going to fetch posts from Reddit's API, which means it's going to do some asynchronous work. Specifically, we're going to be working with promises, and the traditional way to work with promises is to use .then. So I could say fetch, pass in a URL, and then write .then. Then I can work with the data by passing in a callback. And if I need to do something else afterwards, I use .then, and so on and so forth. Whenever I'm doing something asynchronous and I need to use .then, And that can get pretty messy if I'm doing several asynchronous actions. But we're going to use something called Async Await, which is from ES7, that allows us to do the same thing but in a cleaner way. So I'm going to write async here, and inside the function I'm going to write const response equals await fetch. So really what I'm doing here is I'm causing my code to wait until the result of this fetch request is resolved. Sorry, the promise from this fetch request is resolved before moving on to the next line of code. So it's pretty much like using .then, but it's just written in a way that is easier to understand. So what I'm going to be fetching is the post from Reddit's API. So I'm going to use the same link that I had before, but I'm going to write it in a bit of a different way because we need to use variables. So I'm going to use something from ES6 called template literals. And template literals are strings that can interpolate JavaScript data in a really easy way. And I'll show you exactly how that works. So let me write some backticks, and inside them I'll write HTTPS : www.reddit.com/r/ and now I put a $sign in curly braces, and between these two curly braces I can pass in some JavaScript. So I can write 2 + 2, 2 + 3, I can write whatever I want. In this case I'm passing in a variable, and the variable we need is the subreddit. And of course it doesn't exist in this function, so we need to pass it in. Sorry, we need to accept it as a parameter, subreddit. So now when we call fetch post with subreddit, this function will be ready for it, and it'll pass that subreddit into the template literal so we can make a request to that particular subreddit. Don't forget we need .json, and we need some parameters. So we need to put our query string, and the first one we need is limit equals another string interpolation, and here we can write our post per requests. And the next param we need after that is our after. And if after is not going to exist the first time around, but it will on the subsequent requests that we make. So in order to account for that logic, we need to write after param ? So if after param exists, then we need to write ampersand after equals plus after param. Otherwise, that is, if after param doesn't exist, or if it's null, we need to write just an empty string. Don't forget, we also need to accept after param as an argument to this function. When it's called the first time, it's only passing one argument, so after param is going to be undefined, which means this part of the code is going to end up returning the empty string, which is fine because we're only fetching the first page in that case. So we have that. Once we have a response, we can't work with it quite yet because the response object needs to be turned into JSON. And that function is asynchronous as well, so we need to use await one more time. So const response JSON equals await response JSON. Now the JSON is ready to work with. Once we got the JSON, we need to add it to our list of responses. And that is defined by that array all the way up here in line 5, responses. So we need to call responses push and response JSON. So now we've added our response to our list of responses. At this point, our code can go in one of two ways, and it depends on two things. So if inside the response JSON object, the data after property exists, so it's not null, and responses length is smaller than max requests, that means the number of responses that we've gotten is less than the number of responses that we want, and there's an after property, which means there is more to fetch. Remember, there will always be an after property inside the response until there is nothing more to fetch. When there is no more for Reddit to give you, the after property inside the response object will be null. So if the after property inside the response object exists, meaning Reddit has more to give us, and the length of the responses array is less than the value of max request, meaning we want to make more requests, then we need to call fetch posts again. So we're calling it recursively. We're going to call fetch posts, and we're using the same subreddit that was passed in to the initial one, and we're also passing in an after param, and that is going to be from the response JSON object. And we also need to return in order to make sure that no additional code gets run. However, if one of these expressions returns false, that is, if the response object contains the after property of null, or our response's length is equal to max request, which means we've maxed out our request, then that means that we don't want to fetch anymore. And instead, we want to process the responses that we already have. So down here, this is where we'll call parse results with the responses array from the very top. Now let's work with parse results. Parse results is going to take the responses array and turn it into a list of rankings. And right now, the responses array coming in is an array of objects, and each of those objects contains within it the array of posts from that request. And that's a bit tricky to work with because what we really want is one array with all the posts from all the responses. So to make that happen, first, let's just create an empty array called all posts. Const all posts equals empty array. And now what we want to do is loop through the responses array and get all the posts from each of those response objects and push them into all posts. So it's going to look a little something like this. Responses for each, and we want to iterate through and do something with each response. You might remember from the response object that the actual posts themselves are within data and within children. So here we want to call all posts dot push response data children. But you might notice it's missing something here, because if I let the code run as is right now, I'm going to end up with an array of arrays. So really, we're not solving the problem, because what we want is one array with each different post individually. So we can solve that by using some ES6 syntax, something called the spread operator. So by putting ... right before responses data.children, what I'm doing is spreading out all the items from that array and passing them in as separate arguments into the push function. So I'm not actually pushing the array, I'm pushing each item from that array individually. And that allows us to have a flat array with all the posts. This is easier to work with now because now we can take all those posts and loop through them to figure out how we can score each user. So let's make another for each loop. So we'll call all posts for each. And we'll pass in a callback. This time we're going to add a little bit more ES6 to it. So within each post, let's take a look at our example here. The things that we need, the properties that we need are within data. And they are author and all the way down here, score. But it would get really annoying if every time we wanted to access these within our code, we would have to write post.data.author, post.data.score. That can get really tedious. So we can use some more ES6 magic and use something called object destructuring. So instead of post, I'm going to destructure post by replacing it with curly braces. And now I can write the name of the property that I want to access directly. So now I can write data here, and within my code, I can do something with data by referencing it directly. I no longer have to write post.data. I can go even one level deeper by putting a colon on data and putting another set of curly braces, and in here putting author and score, and now I can access author and score directly without having to write post.data.author or post.data.score. So that's really convenient because what we want to do is loop through each of those and add the stats to an object. So let's create this object first. This object is going to be called stats by user. And what we're going to be doing is looping through each of the posts, and on each iteration, we're going to add the score to the object that will be organized by author. So basically, on the first iteration, we might hit somebody with the username Lucas123. So to the stats by user object, we're going to add the Lucas123 key, and as the value, we'll be adding the score and the number of posts. And we'll keep doing that with each one so that we can keep track of all the stats by user. So it looks a little something like this. Inside each of the iterations, I'm going to access stats by user and author. So basically this will be stats by user Lucas123 or stats by user somebody else. If it doesn't exist yet, so that is definitely going to be the case the first time this runs. If it doesn't exist yet, I want to create it as an object with a post count of 1 and a score of whatever score is. So that means the first time this hits, inside this object, I'm creating a value called Lucas123. A key called Lucas123, and the value of that key will be this object with post count 1 and score of score. A little more ES6 magic for you. You can use something called object property shorthand. And if you know that you're defining within an object a property that has the same name as a variable within your scope, you can get rid of the colon here and the name of the variable and just write the name of the property, and it'll automatically know that you're defining this key with the value of the variable that has the same name. So it just kind of saves you an extra, I don't know, millisecond or so. And it's easier to read. So this is how we're defining the property of the object if it doesn't exist yet. However, if it does, it's a little more tricky. That is, if we're hitting a second post by Lucas123, by now the stats by user object already contains a key and a value for Lucas123. So what we want to do now is replace it with an object that has a post count of stats by user author dot post count plus 1. So whatever is there already, we want to add 1 to it because we're adding the count for one more post. And for the score, we want to take whatever score was already there and add the score from this particular iteration, so from this post. So basically we're saying if inside our stats by user object we already have information about Lucas, that is his post count and his score, then we want to add to it 1 because we're adding info from one more post, and we want to add the score from that post. And we want to keep going all the way till we've been through every single post inside the all post array, and by the end of it we'll have all the stats. So we'll have the totals of the scores and the number of posts posted by each user. The information that we need is now in the form of an object, but we can't rank an object. We need an array so we can sort it. So let's create an array out of all these user stats, and let's call it user list. So const user list, and to form this array we're going to call object.keys on stats by user. And what this will do is give us back an array in which each item represents a string that is the key of a property inside stats by user. We can use that array to get back another array of objects by using map. So we'll call .map, and inside map we'll pass in a callback, and in this callback we just need username. Another cool thing about arrow functions is that if you're only passing in one parameter, you don't really need parentheses at all. With the username, we'll return an object. Yet another cool thing about arrow functions is you can use something called implicit return. So I'm going to be returning a value without actually using the return keyword. So I'm returning an object here. I'm returning an object with username as username. So once again, we're using object property shorthand. Score is stats by user, username, score. And post count is going to be stats by username, post count. Now we have our list of users, but we want to sort it so we can have rankings. So let's create sorted list, const sorted list equals user list sort. Sort takes a callback with 2 arguments, A and B, so let's call it user A and user B. And if we wanted this to be ascending, then we would return user A minus user B, or sorry, user A score minus user B score. We want it to be descending. We want the highest to be first. So we'll say return user B score minus user A score. And that should give us a sorted list. And finally, we can call display rankings with our sorted list. inside display rankings, let's get rid of our console log statement. And what we're going to do here is attach each user into the DOM as what we'll call a user card. So first, we need to select the container in which we'll put each of those user cards. And we can do that by writing const container equals document get element by ID and results container. Let's run sorted list dot for each. Pass in a callback. And for each takes up to 3 parameters. The first one is going to be the item being iterated on. That's usually the only one that we use, in this case the user. But if you want to, you can also pass in a second one that is the index. And this time we'll actually use the index because we want to rank. And having access to the index makes it really useful because we already know that the list is in order. So the rank is going to be the index plus 1, since arrays are 0 index. The first item is index 0, but it's the first one at the top, so it's going to be index plus 1. As for the user, we can deconstruct it because we already know what we want from it. So let's access the username, the score, and the post count. And let's do a few things. The first is creating a new element in order to put this information in. So const user card equals document create element, and we'll create an anchor tag. Anchor tags need hrefs, so let's add one by writing user card dot href equals interpolated string, and we'll write https colon / www.reddit.com/user / and then this is where we'll insert the username. And we also need to write a class name, so that's our CSS can target it. So we'll call class list dot add, and we'll add user card. And we will also add some text in there. So user card inner text equals one more interpolated string. This one's gonna have the rank number with a dot, space, username, and post count. Oh, post count. Post and score with point. That's all we need for the user card, but we actually need to attach it to the DOM. So we'll call container append child user card. And that's all we need. Let's see what it looks like. So we'll go back here, type in learn JavaScript, and oh, looks like I made a mistake. Line 26 and 32. Okay, let's go back. And responses, line 32. I didn't spell that properly. And line 33, response data children. I'm gonna save that. Let's go back and try this one more time. I'm gonna go back here, type in learn JavaScript, and there we go. I see a list of the top posters within that subreddit. And that's it. Hope you enjoyed it and you learned something. I only got to scratch the surface on some of this ES6 and ES7, but I'll put some links in the description where you can learn a lot more. In the meantime, don't hesitate to let me know in the comments if you have any more questions. And don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you so much. I'll see you all next time.